The first clue is not a battlefield. It is not a bronze sword pulled from mud, not a fortress wall blackened by fire, not a king boasting of enemies crushed beneath his feet. It is older than kings, older than writing, older than cities, older than the idea of a soldier. It is a mark left on bone after the rest of the body has vanished, a fracture healed crookedly, a sharp wound in a skull, a stone point found where it should not be, a skeleton lying in a place that feels less like an ordinary burial and more like the aftermath of a moment no one survived to explain. Long before banners, armies, borders, and empires, the human story already contains these quiet injuries, and they raise one of the most uncomfortable questions in prehistory. When did violence become more than a sudden act between individuals and begin to turn into war? The question feels simple only from a distance. Up close, it becomes difficult almost immediately. Deep time does not preserve motives. It rarely preserves the scene. It almost never preserves the social rule, the insult, the fear, the hunger, the memory of a raid, or the small chain of decisions that may have led one group of people to harm another. What survives is partial and stubborn bones, tools, sediments, traces of fire, the occasional burial, the shape of a landscape, and later, much later, the first hints that human communities have begun to defend places, store food, and fear strangers in organized ways. Scholars still debate where violence ends and war begins, because a cracked skull is not an army, and a single death is not a battlefield. Yet the evidence, incomplete as it is, suggests that the roots of war grow from something much older than civilization. They reach back into the long age when human beings are still learning how to survive. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because this story is not only about violence, it is also about cooperation, memory, fear, adaptation, and the strange double nature of human life, the same social intelligence that lets people care for one another, share food, teach skills, and cross impossible landscapes can also teach them how to form sides, remember injuries, and strike together. To understand the birth of war, it is tempting to begin with the first obvious battlefields, but that will be starting too late. War does not appear suddenly like a spear thrown out of darkness. It emerges slowly from the conditions of being human living in groups, depending on territory, defending food, recognizing kin, mistrusting outsiders, making tools, learning from others, and carrying stories about danger from one generation to the next. In the oldest layers of the past, no one is building kingdoms yet. There are no walls with towers, no stores of grain waiting behind gates, no commanders giving orders. There are only small bands and scattered communities moving through forests, grasslands, river valleys, coastlines, caves, and cold open country, trying to stay alive in a world that is never still for long. That world matters. Human ancestors did not evolve in a stable garden where one clever species simply rose above all others. For millions of years, the environments of Africa and later Eurasia shift again and again. Forests expand and retreat. Grasslands spread in patches rather than in one simple wave. Lakes swell, shrink, and vanish. Wetlands become dry corridors. Dry corridors become barriers. The old story that humans evolved because Africa merely became a savanna is too neat. What survives in the record suggests something more complicated. Landscapes broken into mosaics, with woodland here, open grass there, riverine shelter in one season, scarcity in another. In such worlds, Survival does not belong to the strongest in any simple sense. It belongs to the flexible, the observant, the socially connected, and sometimes the fortunate. This is important because violence, too, grows inside changing landscapes. A group that can move easily may avoid conflict. A group trapped by drought, cold, cliffs, rival neighbours, or disappearing prey may have fewer choices. When food is scattered and people are mobile, a quarrel may dissolve into distance. When people become attached to a water source, a shelter, a hunting route, a buried memory of ancestors, or later a field and a storehouse, distance is no longer so easy. The possibility of war begins not with hatred alone, but with the slow tightening of the world. More people, fewer options, stronger attachments, sharper boundaries. Yet the earliest humans and their relatives are not simply violent creatures waiting for civilization to give them weapons. They are deeply cooperative beings from the beginning of the human line. Even before Homo sapiens, our ancestors survived by doing things that solitary animals cannot do well: sharing knowledge, reading intentions, carrying food, coordinating movement, learning tool use, watching one another, and adapting old habits to new materials. Around 1.5 million years ago, for example, evidence from East Africa shows that ancient humans are not limited to stone alone. They can shape large animal bone into tools with deliberate skill. That detail may seem far from war, but it matters. It reveals minds able to improvise. A bone is not just a bone. A stone is not just a stone. A landscape is not just danger. It is a field of possibilities. The same capacity is double-edged. A hand that can make a tool for butchery, digging, scraping, or survival can also use an object as a weapon. A memory that stores the location of water can also store the memory of an enemy. A social bond that helps a group defend a vulnerable member can also make the group dangerous when it feels threatened. This is why the story of early violence cannot be separated from the story of early cooperation. They are not opposites from different worlds. They are neighbouring powers inside the same social animal. Still, it would be wrong to imagine prehistoric life as constant warfare. For most of human existence, small communities likely rely on avoidance more often than battle. Moving away is often safer than fighting. Sharing information can be more useful than risking injury. In a world without surgery, antibiotics, or reliable surplus food, even a minor wound can become a serious problem. A fight that injures several capable adults may endanger an entire group's ability to hunt, gather, travel, or care for one another. This simple fact places a brake on violence. It does not remove it, but it means violence has costs. Deep in prehistory, courage is not always charging forward. Sometimes it is knowing when to disappear over the ridge before the next morning. The archaeological record reflects this tension. There are signs of violence, but they are scattered. Some injuries heal, meaning the person lived long after the blow and likely received care. Some wounds do not heal, suggesting death followed closely after trauma. Some skeletons are found alone, others in groups. Some may represent accident, animal attack, interpersonal conflict, execution, ritual behavior, or raid. The evidence remains incomplete because most deaths leave no trace that archaeologists will ever find. Bodies decay, camps vanish, riverbanks shift, caves collapse, open-air sites erode into dust, millions of lives are reduced to silence, and from that silence researchers must avoid saying too much. This restraint is necessary because prehistory is easy to misuse. Some people want the past to prove that humans are naturally peaceful until corrupted by farming, property, or states. Others want it to prove that humans are naturally warlike, and civilization merely gave ancient violence larger tools. The evidence does not fully obey either story. What it shows is more unsettling and more human. People are capable of remarkable care, and the deep record gives examples of survival through cooperation, long learning, and social dependence. People are also capable of harm, sometimes sudden, sometimes organized, sometimes remembered. No single explanation fully accounts for this. Human violence is not a single invention. It is a possibility that appears differently under different pressures. Long before written history begins naming battles, human ancestors passed through moments that must have felt like the edge of disappearance. Populations shrink, climates turn, other kinds of humans appear, move, meet, and vanish. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other archaic groups occupy vast regions, often known to us through fragments so small they seem almost impossible: a tooth, a finger bone, a genome extracted from cold cave sediment. Homo sapiens, too, does not rise from one clean line of triumph. Our origins appear tangled, networked, and repeatedly reshaped by movement and mixture. The human past is not a ladder, it is a braided river, sometimes widening, sometimes splitting, sometimes nearly drying out before flowing on. Inside that braided river, violence is only one current. It may surge in some places and fade in others. It may appear during scarcity, revenge, territorial defense, social breakdown, or the arrival of strangers in a landscape already occupied. It may also be restrained by marriage networks, exchange, seasonal gatherings, shared ancestry, mutual dependence, and the practical wisdom that a wounded neighbour can be tomorrow's ally. War, when it finally emerges in recognisable form, is not simply violence made larger. It requires memory, identity, coordination, and a belief that another group can be treated as a target. That belief does not need cities to exist, but cities will later magnify it. So the story begins in darkness, with no witness and no written name. Somewhere in deep time, an adult human or human relative falls with an injury that reaches the bone. Somewhere else, another survives a blow and carries the healed mark for years. A group moves away from danger, another stays. A tool is made for survival and becomes, in one tense moment, something else. A boundary forms in the mind before it appears on the ground. The first wars are still far ahead, but the ingredients are already present: bodies that can be hurt, minds that remember, groups that protect, landscapes that change, and the uneasy knowledge that survival sometimes means choosing who belongs close and who must be kept away. The first wounds found by archaeology do not speak loudly. They do not arrive with a carved explanation or a witness preserved beside them. They wait in collections, in cave floors, in river sediments, in museum drawers, and in fragments that at first may look like ordinary damage. A skull is lifted from earth with a hole near the temple. A forearm shows a defensive fracture. A stone point rests among ribs. A burial contains bodies placed hurriedly, or not placed at all, as if care was interrupted by shock. At first, such finds can be difficult to read, because bone is not a confession. It can break under falling rock, under trampling hooves, under the pressure of soil, under the teeth of carnivores, or under the hands of other humans. The work of understanding prehistoric violence begins in that uncertainty, where the dead are silent and every mark must be questioned. For a long time, the deep human past was treated through two opposite myths: One imagined early people as innocent wanderers, living in a natural peace before farming, wealth, and hierarchy corrupted them. The other imagined them as brutal creatures locked in endless combat, barely restrained by culture when culture finally arrived. Archaeology has slowly made both pictures harder to defend. The record is neither cleanly peaceful nor universally savage. It is uneven, local, and sometimes frustratingly vague. Some ancient lives show no sign of violent injury at all. Others preserve trauma so clear that it forces itself into the story. What survives in the record suggests that violence existed long before armies, but the form, frequency, and meaning of that violence changed across time and place. One reason the question became more scientific is that researchers learned to treat bone as a record of events. Human bone grows, repairs, and responds. A healed fracture can show that someone survived an injury and lived long enough for the body to mend. The smoothness of healed bone may suggest months or years afterward. A wound with no sign of healing, by contrast, may indicate injury near the time of death. The angle of a cut, the shape of a depression, the pattern of radiating cracks, the presence of embedded stone, and the difference between fresh and dry bone breakage can all help separate accident from attack, though never with perfect certainty. The evidence remains incomplete, but it is no longer invisible. Caves have been especially important, not because early humans lived only in caves, but because caves preserve what open landscapes erase. In the darkness of limestone chambers and rock shelters, sediment can cover bone, cold can slow decay, and fragments can remain protected long after camps in the open have disappeared. In northern Spain, the deep pit known as Cima de los Huesos preserves remains from an ancient human population hundreds of thousands of years old. Among them is a skull with 2 striking injuries to the front of the head, often discussed as one of the earliest possible cases of lethal interpersonal violence. The marks appear similar in shape and position, as if made by repeated blows from the same object. Yet even here, caution matters. Scholars debate details, because a pit full of ancient bones is not a simple scene frozen in time. It is a puzzle assembled from geology, taphonomy, anatomy, and inference. That word, taphonomy, is one of the quiet guardians of this story. It is the study of what happens to remains after death. Without it, every broken bone can become a murder and every scattered skeleton a massacre. Animals gnaw, floods move bodies, sediments press down, roots crack bone. Ancient people sometimes disturb older burials without meaning harm. Later humans dig, build, plough, and reshape the ground. Archaeologists have to ask not only how a person died, but how the body reached the place where it was found, what happened to it afterward, and whether the marks belong to life, death, burial, or long decay. This is why the early history of violence is slow to emerge. It has to survive not only time, but suspicion. Riverbanks tell another kind of story. They are places of food, movement, meeting, and danger. Water draws animals and people alike. It can support life in dry regions and create natural corridors across difficult land. But rivers also destroy their own evidence. They cut banks, shift channels, bury old surfaces, expose bones, and scatter them again. When remains are found near ancient watercourses, researchers must decide whether they lie there because people lived nearby, because bodies were buried there, because water carried them, or because a violent event happened close to the river's edge. The landscape is both archive and thief. Some of the most haunting evidence comes from burial grounds or mass death sites where many individuals are found together. These places seem, at first glance, to promise clarity. A group of dead bodies must mean an event. But even mass death is not always war. Disease, famine, accident, ritual killing, execution, environmental disaster, and conflict can all leave clusters of human remains. At some sites, the pattern of injuries suggests organised or repeated violence. At others, the interpretation changes as methods improve. A famous late Ice Age cemetery in the Nile Valley, often discussed in the history of prehistoric violence, contains many skeletons with signs of trauma and embedded stone fragments. For decades, it has been used as evidence that group conflict existed before farming. More recent study has complicated the picture, suggesting that the injuries may reflect repeated episodes of violence across time rather than one single battle. That does not make the site less important. It makes it more human, because violence in small-scale societies may often have been episodic, remembered, and recurring rather than neatly arranged like later warfare. Then there are sites that seem to catch violence in a sharper frame. In East Africa, at a place once near a watery landscape, human remains from around 10,000 years ago have been interpreted by some researchers as evidence of a violent encounter among mobile foragers. The injuries include blunt force trauma and projectile wounds. The scene is troubling because it belongs to a time before full agricultural settlement in that region, challenging the idea that war only begins when people become farmers. Yet even this evidence is debated. Some scholars question whether all the bodies belong to one event, whether the scene represents massacre, raiding, execution, or another form of lethal conflict. No single explanation fully accounts for every detail. The power of the site lies partly in that uncertainty. It shows that the border between interpersonal violence and group violence is not always clean. The earliest discoveries of violent trauma also changed how scholars thought about weapons. A stone blade or spear point is not automatically a weapon of war. Most tools in prehistory serve many purposes. Points can hunt animals, blades can cut hides, plants, meat, and fibers. Heavy stones can crack marrow bones. A club can defend against predators as easily as threaten a human rival. But when a tool is found embedded in human bone, or when a wound matches a known weapon form, the interpretation tightens. Even then, the difference between hunting accident, personal attack, and group conflict can be difficult to prove. Archaeology can show that a sharp object entered a body. It cannot always show the social world behind the strike. This is where the study of early violence becomes more than forensic analysis. Each wound sits inside a wider pattern. Are the injuries mostly on the head, suggesting face-to-face blows? Are they on the arms, suggesting defense? Are they clustered among adults of one sex, or spread broadly? Are bodies treated carefully afterward, or left exposed? Are there signs of burning, binding, repeated attacks, or missing remains? Is the site isolated, or part of a region where similar injuries appear again and again? The answers can move a discovery from accident toward conflict, from conflict toward raiding, from raiding toward something closer to war. But the movement is careful, because the past punishes certainty that arrives too quickly. What these first wounds found have done is remove the comfort of simple stories. They show that violence is ancient, but not constant. They show that humans and their relatives were vulnerable, but also cared for the injured. They show that tools could become weapons, but were not made only for killing. They show that small groups could clash, but also that the birth of war required more than anger. It required patterns, memory, identity, and a world in which the cost of attacking another group sometimes seemed lower than the cost of retreating. The bones do not yet give us armies. They give us something older and harder to face the moment when survival, fear, and social life leave their first scars. To imagine a world without war is not to imagine a world without fear. The early human landscape is not gentle. It is full of sharp weather, long hunger, predators with better teeth, rival scavengers, sudden illness, injuries that can turn serious in silence, and distances that punish every mistake. But it is not yet a world organized around armies, borders, commanders, or permanent enemies. For most of the long human past, people live in small mobile groups whose survival depends less on domination than on attention to tracks in mud, fruiting trees, animal migrations, seasonal water, safe shelters, useful stone, remembered paths, and the moods of the people moving beside them. The daily problem is not conquest. It is getting through the day, and then the next one, without losing the delicate web of cooperation that keeps everyone alive. In this world, the human group is not a crowd. It is a moving life support system. One person knows where a certain tuber grows after rain. Another remembers the bend in a river where animals cross. Another is better at reading cloud. Another at shaping a sharp edge from stone. Another at noticing when vultures circle over a distant carcass. Knowledge does not sit in a library or a written law. It lives inside bodies, habits, gestures, routines, and memory. It is carried by people who cannot be easily replaced. A group that loses too many experienced adults loses not only strength, but maps, recipes, warnings, and techniques. This alone makes constant violence dangerous. Fighting is not merely a dramatic risk. It is an economic disaster, a social wound, and sometimes a slow path toward disappearance. That is why organized war is not an obvious beginning point for humanity. Small groups can fight, and sometimes they do. Individuals can become angry, jealous, afraid, or vengeful. Communities can remember injuries and defend themselves. But regular war requires something more than the capacity to harm. It requires repeated coordination, a shared idea of an opposing group, enough people to attack and recover, and often some attachment to a place or resource that seems worth the risk. Early foragers are often mobile, and mobility changes everything. If the world is wide enough and the pressure is not too severe, moving away can solve what violence would only worsen. A tense encounter at a water source, a dispute over meat, a dangerous stranger near camp, a threat from a neighbouring band, any of these might end not in a heroic stand, but in departure. The footprint fades, the group shifts its route. The story becomes a warning carried quietly to another valley. This does not mean life is peaceful in the modern sentimental sense. Early human communities are not floating above conflict. They contain rivalry, attraction, resentment, fear, generosity, patience, and anger, just as later communities do. But conflict inside a small group is constrained by dependence. The person who irritates you may also be the person who knows how to make a tool, find water, prepare food safely, or help during travel. The same hands that could strike are hands the group may need tomorrow. In many small-scale societies known from ethnography, serious conflict is often managed through avoidance, mediation, joking, separation, exchange, or temporary movement before it escalates. These modern examples cannot simply be projected backward as exact replicas of ancient life, but they remind us that people do not need states or written laws to develop ways of lowering tension. What survives in the record suggests violence existed, yet what does not fossilize is equally important: restraint, negotiation, and the quiet intelligence of walking away. The landscape encourages that flexibility. For hundreds of thousands of years, human ancestors and later Homo sapiens lived through environmental change that does not behave like a single straight line. The world does not simply become dry, then open, then human. It shifts in patches: woodland, grassland, wetland, rocky shelter, coast, lake margin, and highland create mosaics of opportunity and danger. A group that can use many foods and many places has more ways to avoid crisis. Flexible eating matters here. The old image of early humans as mighty hunters striding across the plains is only part of the story, and sometimes not the most important part. Survival may come from gathered plants, shellfish, insects, eggs, small animals, scavenged meat, marrow, underground storage organs, fish, nuts, seeds, and whatever a local season allows. A human being who can live from many sources is harder to corner than a specialist tied to one narrow niche. This broad diet does something subtle to the story of violence. When people can shift foods, shift camps, and shift routes, conflict over one resource may not need to become deadly. If one valley is tense, another may be possible. If large prey fail, smaller resources may fill the gap. If a carcass is contested by dangerous animals or rival humans, the safest choice may be to retreat and remember. But flexibility has limits. Drought can shrink alternatives. Cold can compress movement. Population growth can fill once empty spaces. Coastlines can change. Rivers can fail. A group that once avoided trouble may find that every direction now leads into someone else's range. The world without war is not permanent. It depends on space, options, and relationships. Relationships may be the greatest hidden technology of early humans. Stone tools preserve well, so they dominate museum cases and textbooks. But social networks may have mattered just as much. A tool can cut, scrape, pierce, and crush. A relationship can carry information across distance. It can open access to mates beyond a local group, reducing inbreeding. It can create obligations of sharing during lean times. It can turn strangers into distant kin. It can allow people to gather seasonally, exchange materials, learn songs, observe techniques, and pass along news of danger. The evidence for such networks is sometimes indirect stone moved from distant sources, shells carried inland, pigments transported, similarities in tool traditions across wide areas, genetic signals of mixture and movement. The evidence remains incomplete, but it points toward a species that survives not as isolated bands of geniuses but as connected communities. This is one of the deepest differences between violence and war. Violence can erupt from a moment. War grows from a social map. To attack another group, people must identify them as separate enough to target, remember previous encounters, coordinate action, and accept the risk of retaliation. Early humans certainly could distinguish familiar people from unfamiliar ones. That ability is ancient and useful, but social boundaries are not always walls. They can be porous, shifting, seasonal, and negotiated. A neighbouring group may be competitor in one season, exchange partner in another, marriage connection in another, and source of vital information during a crisis. The line between outsider and ally may depend on memory, kinship, need, and distance. Before permanent borders, human geography is often made of paths rather than lines. Children, when present in these communities, belong to that protective social world rather than to the world of conflict. They are carriers of the future, learners of language, gesture, food knowledge, and belonging. The story of early violence does not require imagining them in scenes of harm. The more important point is that small groups invest heavily in the survival and teaching of the young. That long period of human learning is one reason cooperation matters so much. Humans are not born ready to survive alone. They must be shown how the world works. A society that destroys its own web of care risks more than a single life. It risks the chain of knowledge that allows the group to continue. So the world without war is not innocent. It is balanced. It contains fear, but also avoidance. It contains anger, but also dependence. It contains weapons, but also tools whose main purpose is food, shelter, and work. It contains strangers, but also networks that may turn strangers into relatives. The earliest human story is not a march toward battle. It is a long experiment in staying alive under changing conditions. War will become possible when those conditions tighten, when groups become more fixed, when resources become more defensible, when memory hardens into grievance, and when identity begins to draw sharper edges around us and them. But before that hardening, there is movement, footprints crossing old lake beds, smoke rising and fading, people watching the horizon, choosing more often than not to survive by connection, patience, and distance. The body that carries these early tensions is not built like the body of a natural conqueror. It is built like a compromise. A human being is strong in some ways and strangely exposed in others, soft-skinned, slow compared with many predators, weak-jawed beside the great cats and hyenas, without claws, without horns, without armor, and dependent for years on learning before full independence is possible. Yet this vulnerable body also carries unusual powers. It walks upright across long distances. It frees the hands. It sweats efficiently under heat. It sees the world from a higher angle than a knuckle walker in the grass. It can throw with accuracy, grip with precision, and turn a stone, stick, bone, shell, or fibre into something more useful than its natural form. If war eventually grows from the human condition, it grows from this strange body, not the strongest animal in the landscape, but one of the most adaptable. Bipedalism changes the story before there is any story to tell. Long before Homo sapiens, early hominins are experimenting with upright movement in environments that are not one simple savanna, but shifting mosaics of woodland, open ground, wetlands, and broken terrain. Scholars still debate the details of some of the earliest candidates, including how confidently particular fossils can be placed on the human line and how often they walked on two legs. But the broader transformation is unmistakable over time. Upright walking does not make early hominins superior in any dramatic way. It probably makes them different in several small useful ways at once. Hands become available for carrying food, infants, tools, or gathered materials. Movement between patches of resources becomes more efficient. The body becomes a travelling platform for observation and transport. Survival is rarely transformed by one grand miracle. More often, it shifts through 100 small advantages that matter only because the world keeps changing. The hand is one of those advantages. It is not just a weapon hand, and that matters. It is a gathering hand, a carrying hand, a tool-making hand, a teaching hand, a signalling hand. It can hold a stone core while another stone strikes it. It can strip bark, crack bone, shape wood, scrape hide, prepare food, and touch another person with care. The same hand can also strike. This double possibility sits quietly inside every discussion of early violence. A hand capable of delicate cooperation is also capable of deliberate harm. But in the deep past, the more important fact may be that hands allow humans to bring parts of the landscape into social life. A sharp stone is not only found, it is selected, carried, modified, used, discarded, copied, and improved. A tool is a memory made physical. This is why the body cannot be separated from culture, even very early culture. Humans do not survive because anatomy alone gives them victory. Teeth shrink, claws never arrive. Speed remains unimpressive. A lone human in the Pleistocene is often a fragile creature. But humans are rarely only anatomical individuals. They are bodies embedded in groups, and groups change what a body can do. A person with a stone point, companions, fire, memory, and a route through difficult land is not the same creature as a person alone and lost. Social intelligence becomes almost like an external organ. It extends the body beyond skin. It lets people hunt cooperatively, avoid danger, share tasks, watch over one another, and learn without each generation beginning from nothing. The skull and brain carry this same double edge. Human intelligence is not simply the ability to invent weapons, it is the ability to imagine what others know, intend, remember, fear, and value. That ability helps with trust. It also helps with deception. It helps with alliance. It also helps with ambush. It helps a group coordinate a hunt, but it can also help a group coordinate a raid. The birth of war, much later, depends not on rage alone, but on planning, moving together, waiting, reading another group's habits, choosing a time, remembering paths, deciding who belongs on which side. These are social abilities before they are military abilities. They arise because life in groups is complicated, and because survival often requires understanding minds other than one's own. Still, the body remains vulnerable, and that vulnerability restrains violence as much as it enables it. Prehistoric injuries are not trivial inconveniences. A broken arm can mean failure to gather, climb, carry, make tools, or defend oneself. A damaged leg can make migration impossible. A deep cut can become infection. A blow to the head can change speech, memory, balance, or personality. Every serious fight risks reducing the group's ability to function. This is one reason the earliest human violence should not be imagined as endless combat. The cost of injury is too high. In small communities, the loss of even one experienced adult can mean the loss of knowledge, food, protection, and future connection. Violence is possible, but it is never free. The other human species and relatives of our line deepen this picture. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and early Homo sapiens are not characters in a simple tournament where one is strong, one is smart, and one wins. They are closely related humans or human relatives, adapted to different landscapes across Africa and Eurasia, each carrying its own mixture of strengths and limits. Neanderthals are powerfully built, especially suited in many ways to cold and demanding environments. With robust bodies, strong arms, large faces, and brains as large as or larger than those of modern humans on average. Their bones sometimes show high levels of trauma, though scholars still debate how much of this reflects violence, dangerous hunting, accidents, lifestyle, preservation bias, or some combination. It is tempting to imagine them as brutal, but temptation is not evidence. What survives suggests lives of difficulty, skill, and care. Not a cartoon of primitive aggression. Denisovans are even more elusive. For years, they are known less as bodies than as a genetic presence, a population revealed from fragments so small they almost mock the old confidence of archaeology, a finger bone, teeth, traces in DNA, and later evidence from sediments and scattered fossils linked to wider populations. Their physical appearance remains partly unknown, their culture hard to see directly, their range probably broad but still debated. Yet their genetic legacy in some present-day populations shows they were not ghosts outside the human story. They met ancestors of living people. They mixed, in some environments. Inherited Denisovan-related variants may have helped later humans adapt, most famously in high-altitude contexts. That does not mean Denisovans existed to help Homo sapiens survive, or that their genes saved us in any simple way. It means human survival was tangled. Bodies met other bodies, the populations mixed, separated, endured, and vanished. This matters for violence because contact between human groups is not automatically war. When Homo sapiens encounters Neanderthals, Denisovans, or other archaic populations, those meetings may include avoidance, competition, exchange, interbreeding, territorial tension, and perhaps violence in some places. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the disappearance of these other groups. Climate instability, small population size, fragmented ranges, disease, competition, assimilation into larger populations, and chance may all have played roles. It is too simple to say that modern humans exterminated them, just as it is too simple to say everyone blended peacefully. Deep time rarely gives such clean moral shapes. It gives mixture, silence, and fragments. The human body, then, is not a weapon designed for war. It is a survival instrument shaped by movement, cooperation, improvisation, and risk. Its upright posture carries food and tools across uncertain ground. Its hands make technology possible. Its brain reads other minds. Its voice and gestures turn experience into shared memory. Its wounds remind us how costly violence can be. And its relationships with other human forms show that identity itself was once more fluid than later myths allow. Before armies, before tribes harden into political enemies, before walls rise around stored grain, there are bodies moving through difficult worlds, strong enough to endure, fragile enough to need one another, clever enough to cooperate, and dangerous enough that, under pressure, the same gifts that preserve life can be turned toward organized harm. Inside a small group, danger does not always come from beyond the horizon. It can grow beside the hearth, along a walking route, around the sharing of meat, inside a memory of insult, or in the tension between people who depend on one another but do not always trust one another. The deep past is often imagined as a struggle between humans and nature, with predators at the edge of camp and cold winds pressing against the skin. That struggle is real enough, but human beings also carry another kind of weather with them. They live in social climates, and social climates can turn. A group may be bound together by kinship, affection, obligation, and practical need. Yet within that same group there may be rivalry, resentment, fear, jealousy, competition for status, and the quiet danger of a dispute that fails to cool before it hardens. This is one of the places where early violence must be separated carefully from war. A single act of violence, even a lethal one, is not the same as organized conflict between groups. An adult killed in anger, a quarrel that turns physical, a revenge attack after a personal wrong, or a dangerous confrontation between two individuals may leave marks on bone that look dramatic to archaeologists, but they do not automatically reveal armies, raids, or long-standing enemies. They reveal that human relationships can fail. War requires a broader social frame. It requires a group acting as a group against another group understood as separate, threatening, or available to be harmed. Interpersonal violence can exist without war, and for most of deep time, much of what appears in the bones may belong to that smaller and more intimate world. The evidence remains incomplete because the most important parts of social conflict do not fossilize. No sediment preserves a grudge. No skull fracture explains whether the blow followed a dispute over food, a broken alliance, a mating conflict, fear of sorcery, a leadership challenge, or an accident mistaken by later eyes for aggression. Archaeology can sometimes show the injury, the weapon type, the age of the wound, and whether healing occurred. It cannot easily show the emotional sequence that led there. This matters because small group violence can be sudden and personal. It can also be patterned by rules, customs, or expectations that are now entirely lost. Some communities may have had ways of managing aggression that left no trace at all: separation, public criticism, compensation, ritual restraint, temporary exile, or the intervention of respected adults. The absence of evidence for such practices is not evidence that they did not exist. Among mobile foragers, dependence acts as both glue and pressure. People need one another, but need can make conflict sharper. Food sharing is generous, but it also creates expectation. Skill brings respect, but respect can become rivalry. Leadership, where it exists, is often situational rather than absolute. The best tracker, the most persuasive speaker, the most knowledgeable gatherer, or the most experienced traveller may hold influence in different moments. Such influence can be resented if it becomes too controlling. Many small-scale societies known from more recent history have mechanisms to prevent individuals from becoming too dominant: ridicule, refusal to cooperate, quiet departure, or collective pressure. These comparisons must be used carefully, because living societies are not fossils of the Paleolithic, but they help us imagine something important before kings. People still understood power, and they often worked hard to keep it from becoming dangerous. Yet sometimes the mechanisms fail. A person who repeatedly threatens others may become a problem the group cannot ignore. A dispute may split relatives. A remembered harm may demand response. In very small communities, the boundary between personal revenge and group conflict can blur. If one adult harms another, kin may become involved. If kin become involved, alliances form. If alliances form across camp boundaries, a personal injury can become a wider feud. This is not quite war, but it is one of war's ancestors. It teaches people to think in sides. It trains memory to carry injury beyond the moment. It makes violence social rather than merely individual. Scholars still debate how often such patterns occurred in deep prehistory, but the logic is not difficult to see. Humans do not remember pain only as private experience. They weave it into relationships. Revenge is especially powerful because it can look like justice from inside a group and like aggression from outside it. In the absence of courts, police, or written law, communities still need ways to respond to harm. Some responses may be restorative, others may be retaliatory. The problem is that retaliation rarely stays neat. One group's rightful answer becomes another group's fresh grievance. A death calls for a death. A wound calls for a wound. A stolen object, an accusation, a trespass, or an insult can grow larger as it passes through memory. Over time, the original cause may matter less than the fact that two sides now expect danger from one another. This is one of the quiet bridges from violence to warfare, not technology, not farming, not male aggression alone, but memory arranged around obligation. Accident complicates everything. The prehistoric world is filled with dangerous tasks. Hunting large animals can break bones. Scavenging near predators can turn fatal. Climbing, carrying, tool-making, cutting, and moving across rough country all produce injuries. A person struck by a falling stone or wounded during a hunt may leave trauma that resembles violence. A projectile intended for prey may injure a human by mistake. A blow delivered in a ritual contest may not be meant to kill, yet may do so. Even in later societies, where documents exist, distinguishing accident, punishment, sport, execution, and murder can be difficult. In prehistory, where only the body remains, uncertainty is unavoidable. What survives in the record suggests harm, but not always intention. Ritualized aggression may have been another way of containing danger, though it is difficult to prove archaeologically. Human societies often create controlled forms of conflict displays, contests, threats, formal duels, dances, symbolic weapons, or public confrontations that allow tension to be expressed without turning into uncontrolled killing. Such practices can reduce violence, but they can also intensify it when display becomes real attack. In deep prehistory, traces of pigment, ornament, unusual burials, or repeated patterns of injury sometimes invite speculation about ritual behavior. But caution is necessary. A striking pattern is not automatically a ceremony. A wound is not automatically a duel. Still, it would be surprising if early humans, with their rich social intelligence, had no ways of dramatizing conflict before it became lethal. The human mind turns danger into meaning as readily as it turns stone into tools. The presence of care makes the picture even more complex. Many ancient skeletons show healed injuries. Some individuals survive fractures, dental problems, or conditions that would have made life difficult without help. This means that groups capable of violence were also capable of support over long periods. A person injured in a fight might later be cared for by the same social world that produced the conflict. A wounded adult might continue to contribute through knowledge, memory, tool-making, or teaching even after physical strength is reduced. The deep past does not divide easily into cruelty and kindness. It holds both in the same hands. The same community that protects can punish. The same kinship that feeds can demand revenge. The same memory that preserves technique can preserve anger. This is why the birth of war cannot be explained by saying humans discovered weapons and became violent. The interior life of small groups already contains the emotional and social materials from which larger conflicts can later be built. There is fear of the outsider, but also fear of the dangerous insider. There is loyalty, but also rivalry. There is justice, but also revenge. There is cooperation, but also the constant negotiation of who receives food, who carries influence, who is trusted, who is watched, and who can be allowed to remain close. Before battlefields, before fortified villages, before warriors as a recognized identity, there are small human communities learning how to live with the dangerous fact that they need one another. And perhaps that is the most unsettling beginning of war, not hatred of strangers alone, but the deep social intensity of human life. A solitary animal can fight, flee, or submit. A human group can remember, discuss, blame, forgive, exclude, recruit, and wait. It can turn a private injury into a shared obligation. It can turn fear into a story. It can turn one death into a boundary that lasts beyond the season. Most of the time, survival probably favours restraint, because the costs of violence are severe. But when restraint fails, the damage does not end with the body on the ground. It enters memory. It becomes part of the map. And once violence becomes something a group remembers together, the path toward war, though still long and uncertain, has already begun. The memory of violence does not form in an empty world. It forms in weather, hunger, distance, dust, cold, wet seasons, failed seasons, and the slow rearrangement of the land beneath human feet. A quarrel inside a small group may begin with emotion, but the conditions that make conflict harder to escape often come from outside the group entirely. A valley dries, a herd changes its route, a lake retreats from its old shore and leaves behind mud, salt, and cracked ground. A forest edge moves, a familiar patch of edible plants fails. A shelter that once sits near water becomes useless. Another group appears where no one expected them, not because they are invaders in any modern sense, but because the same pressure has pushed them too. In deep prehistory, violence grows not only from human intention, but from landscapes that repeatedly narrow the choices available to human beings. The African world in which the human line begins is not a simple stage set. It is not one long transformation from forest into open grassland, with humans rising as if the land itself has written a destiny for them. The evidence points instead to patchiness, instability, and variety. After roughly 10 million years ago, many African environments change in ways that include the spread of C4 grasses, the plants that later dominate many tropical grasslands and savannas. But this does not mean a single dry savanna replaces a single ancient forest. The better image is a broken mosaic wooded corridors, open patches, river margins, seasonal wetlands, lake basins, shrublands, and grasslands shifting across time. For early hominins, such a world rewards flexibility. It also punishes those who cannot adjust when the familiar pattern breaks. That environmental complexity helps explain why survival in the human story is rarely about raw strength alone. A strong animal can still starve if its food disappears. A powerful predator can still fail if prey move beyond reach. A specialized creature may be brilliant in one setting and helpless in another. Human ancestors, by contrast, move gradually toward a different strategy, walking across varied ground, eating a broad diet, learning socially, using tools, and carrying knowledge from place to place. These traits do not remove danger. They give groups more ways to respond before danger becomes catastrophe. Yet they also bring different groups into contact across wider ranges. A species that can cross many landscapes is also a species that meets others crossing them. Climate swings become especially important during the Pleistocene, the long epoch of ice ages and warmer intervals that shapes the later human world. Glaciers expand and retreat far to the north, but their influence reaches far beyond the ice itself. Rain belts shift. Deserts grow and shrink. Lakes appear in basins that now dry, then vanish again. Coastlines move as sea levels fall and rise. Grasslands open in some places while forests thicken in others. A place that supports animals and people for generations can become marginal within the span of a climatic shift. Another place, once difficult, can become a corridor. Human groups do not simply live in environments. They live through environments that behave almost like moving doors. Those doors matter for violence because mobility is both escape and collision. When the land is generous and open, a group under pressure can move outward, split, seek new resources, or rebuild alliances elsewhere. But when desirable areas shrink into refuges, movement can force people together. River valleys, lake shores, coastlines, caves, highland passes, and seasonal hunting grounds become more important when surrounding landscapes are harsher. The more a resource stands out, the more it can draw multiple groups into the same space. This does not automatically produce war. People can share, alternate trade, intermarry, avoid, or negotiate. But the possibility of conflict rises when the same narrow places become essential to more than one community. Water is one of the oldest pressures. It concentrates life with a force almost nothing else can match. Animals come to drink. Plants grow near it. Fish, shellfish, reeds, birds, and grazing herds may gather around it. People follow, not because they are foolish enough to ignore danger, but because water offers the richest returns. A lake margin or river bend can become a meeting ground, a pantry, a map point, and a risk all at once. The same wetland that feeds a group may attract predators, scavengers, and unfamiliar humans. A dry season can turn many scattered water sources into a few crowded ones. What had been a wide landscape of options becomes a set of bottlenecks. Prehistoric violence often becomes easier to imagine at such bottlenecks, though not always easier to prove. A group arrives at a familiar water source and finds others already there. The newcomers may be relatives, distant exchange partners, complete strangers, or people remembered from an older dispute. Everyone is tired. Everyone has reason to stay. Weapons meant for hunting are close at hand. The situation does not need hatred to become dangerous. It needs need, fear, and uncertainty. In a world without written borders, territory may still exist as memory. This path is ours because our elders used it. This spring is ours because we return each dry season. This shelter is ours because our dead are nearby. This hunting ground is ours because losing it may mean hunger. Changing prey also changes human relations. Large animals are not evenly distributed across space and time. Their migrations shift with climate, vegetation, water, and predator pressure. Human groups that depend partly on them must track patterns across seasons and years. When herds are abundant, hunting territories may overlap with less danger. When herds decline or become unpredictable, the same overlap can sharpen. Scavenging may work in one landscape and fail in another. Plant foods may compensate, but only if people know where and when to find them. Coastal resources may provide stability, but only for groups with access to coasts and the knowledge to use them. The human advantage is flexibility, yet flexibility does not mean endless abundance. It means surviving by changing tactics, and sometimes every tactic is already being tried by someone else. One lesser-known pressure comes from the fact that climatic change can preserve and erase evidence unevenly. Some of the very landscapes where conflict may have been most likely river edges, lake margins, open camps near seasonal resources are also places where erosion, flooding, and sediment movement can destroy the record. This means archaeology may undercount moments of violence in unstable environments. At the same time, some dramatic sites survive precisely because a sudden burial, cave deposit or unusual sediment condition protected them. The record is therefore not a transparent window. It is more like a broken mirror, reflecting some pressures sharply and losing others entirely. Scholars still debate not only how much violence occurred, but how much of it archaeology is capable of seeing. Population size adds another layer. A small population may avoid others simply because there are few others to meet. A growing population fills space more densely, making encounters more common and escape more difficult. Yet population pressure is not a simple formula. More people can mean more conflict, but it can also mean larger social networks, more exchange, greater innovation, and stronger support during hard times. In some periods, human ancestors may have passed through severe demographic stress. One much-discussed genetic model proposes a deep population bottleneck around the transition from the early to middle Pleistocene, suggesting that ancestral numbers may have fallen dramatically, though the scale and interpretation remain debated. Whether or not that specific model captures the full reality, the larger point is clear human survival has passed through narrow places before. Populations shrink, connections break, isolated groups become vulnerable in such conditions. Conflict may not be the main danger, but it can become one more pressure on groups already close to the edge. As Homo sapiens later expands its ecological range, the relationship between environment and violence becomes even more complicated. By tens of thousands of years ago, humans are not confined to one kind of homeland. They are learning forests, coasts, deserts, cold steppes, highlands, river valleys, and tropical worlds. They enter places where visibility is poor, where food is abundant but hidden, where animals behave differently, where plants require specialized knowledge, where stone suitable for tools may be scarce, where seasonal timing decides survival. This widening niche is one reason Homo sapiens endures, but expansion also means encounter. Every new environment may already contain other humans, other memories, other roots, and other claims shaped by older use. The landscape of pressure, then, is not a background painting behind the birth of war. It is one of the engines. It does not force humans into violence like puppets. It changes the cost of choices. It can make avoidance easier or harder, sharing more necessary or more fragile, strangers more useful or more frightening. It can turn a broad world into a narrow corridor, a flexible range into a defended place, a seasonal meeting into a dangerous confrontation. Long before walls and armies, the land itself teaches humans that survival depends on movement, memory, and belonging. And when the land tightens, those same gifts can begin to draw lines that no one has carved into stone, but everyone knows are there. A weapon does not always begin its life as a weapon. In the deep human past, this is one of the hardest truths to hold in mind. A sharp stone edge can open an animal carcass, scrape a hide, cut plants, shape wood, prepare fibers, or divide meat among people who have waited all day for food. A heavy cobble can crack a marrow bone, pound seeds, break shell, or, in a moment of fear, crush a skull. A spear can bring down prey, keep a predator at distance, probe a riverbank, or become the point at which one human group refuses another passage. Long before there are soldiers, there are tools. Long before there are armies, there are hands trained to make objects more dangerous, more precise, and more useful than nature left them. The birth of war does not require a new material world so much as a new social use for one that already exists. Stone dominates the archaeological imagination because stone survives, wood rots, hide decays, Fibre disappears, bone often breaks down, and plant material vanishes unless preserved by unusual conditions. Stone remains stubborn. It lies in sediments after the makers are gone, after camps are erased, after language and memory have vanished. Because of this, the oldest human technological record can look harder, sharper, and more weapon-centered than life itself probably was. A scatter of stone flakes may represent butchery, repair, craft, teaching, food preparation, or a brief stop beside water. It may contain no violence at all. Yet stone also gives early humans the ability to cut into bodies with a precision their teeth and nails cannot manage. That power changes the relationship between anatomy and survival. Humans do not need to evolve claws when they can carry edges. The earlier stone tools are not swords waiting to happen. They're practical solutions in a world of meat, plants, hides, bones, and raw material. Older one tools, simple as they may appear to modern eyes, mark a profound shift. A hominin can strike one stone against another and create a cutting edge sharper than the body itself. Later Achillean hand axes and cleavers show more planning, symmetry, and repeated habits of making. These objects may be beautiful in their balance, but beauty is not their purpose. They are multi-purpose tools, and that multi-purpose nature makes interpretation difficult. If a hand axe is found at a site, it does not mean people fought there. If a sharp flake bears traces of meat, it does not reveal whether the meat came from hunting, scavenging, sharing, or conflict. The evidence remains incomplete because the object alone cannot tell us the intention behind the hand. Bone adds another layer, and a surprisingly early one. Around 1.5 million years ago in East Africa, large animal bones, including those of massive creatures such as hippos and elephants, appear to have been deliberately shaped into tools. This is not the behavior of a creature trapped inside one technique. It suggests flexibility when stone is not the only answer. Bone can become a working material. The detail is small beside the later spectacle of spears and fortifications, but it matters deeply. It shows that early humans or their relatives are already reading the landscape for possibilities beyond the obvious. A fragment left from death can become an instrument of life. Such improvisation helps explain survival across unstable worlds. It also reminds us that the materials of violence, when violence occurs, are often borrowed from ordinary survival. Wood may have been even more important than stone in daily life, but it is usually missing. A sharpened stick can be a digging tool, a walking aid, a lever, a fire-tending rod, a fishing implement, or a thrusting spear. Its absence from most sites is not evidence of absence in life. Under rare preservation conditions, ancient wooden weapons and tools have survived, and they reveal impressive skill. The famous wooden spears from northern Europe, hundreds of thousands of years old, are carefully shaped objects often linked to hunting large animals. They show that early humans were capable of planning in wood with balance and purpose. But because wood almost always disappears, much of the oldest weaponry may be archaeologically invisible. The deep past may have been filled with pointed shafts that left no trace except, occasionally, the wound they made. The spear is a turning point because it extends the human body. A hand can strike only as far as the arm reaches. A spear lengthens intention. It lets a person keep distance from an animal, channel force through a point, and act with companions. A thrusting spear used at close range demands courage and coordination. A thrown spear or later projectile weapon adds another kind of distance, making it possible to harm from beyond immediate reach. In hunting, this is transformative. Against other humans, it is equally serious. Distance changes fear. It allows attack with less immediate exposure. It allows multiple people to act together. It allows injury before bodies close. But again, the same object can belong to the hunt, defense, threat, display, or murder. A spear is not proof of war. It is proof that humans have learned to project force. Projectile technology deepens the problem. Stone points, backed blades, darts, arrows, and later bows create new relationships between bodies and space. They require skill not only in making, but in choosing materials, shaping shafts, attaching points, preparing adhesives, and understanding flight. Composite tools are especially revealing because they combine different substances into one planned object: stone, wood, sinew, resin, plant fiber, and sometimes pigment or heat treatment. Such tools show cumulative knowledge. No one invents every part alone every morning. Techniques pass through observation and teaching. A projectile is therefore not only a weapon or hunting device, it is a social product, a small archive of shared knowledge. When projectile injuries appear in human remains, the story becomes sharper but not always clear. An embedded point in bone is among the strongest forms of evidence that a person was struck by a weapon. Even then, scholars must ask whether the injury came from interpersonal violence, group conflict, execution, accident, or a hunting mishap. The body may show the wound, but not the scene. If many individuals at a site show projectile trauma, especially in patterns consistent with attack, the case for conflict strengthens. If injuries cluster in ways that suggest repeated episodes, raiding or feud becomes possible. If bodies are abandoned, bound, burned, or placed without ordinary care, interpretations may move toward massacre or social breakdown. Yet the past resists neat categories. No single wound can carry the whole burden of war. Clubs and blunt weapons are even harder to see. A wooden club almost never survives. A rounded stone may be a hammer stone, a tool for cracking bone, a grinder, a sling stone, or a weapon. A skull fracture may match a blow, but the object itself may be gone. Blunt force trauma appears in many prehistoric remains, and some of it almost certainly reflects violence. But blows can also come from falls, accidents, trampling, or later damage. Archaeologists therefore look for patterns: repeated head injuries, similar wound shapes, defensive fractures in the arms, differences between healed and unhealed trauma, and the wider context of burial or abandonment. The difficulty is not lack of imagination. It is the need to keep imagination disciplined. Fire, too, sits at the edge of the story. It is warmth, light, protection, cooking, social center, and technological aid. It may also be used to threaten, drive animals, clear areas, or destroy shelters. Later warfare will make fire one of its oldest companions, but in deep prehistory, evidence for fire as a weapon against humans is hard to establish. Burned bone, ash layers, and charred sites can result from cooking, hearth cleaning, accidental burning, ritual activity, environmental fire, or violence. Fire is powerful precisely because it belongs to so many human activities at once. Like stone and wood, it refuses to stay in one category. What changes over time is not simply the sharpness of tools, but the social imagination around them. A spear made for hunting can become a symbol of adulthood, skill, courage, or defense. A projectile point can travel through exchange and carry information about distant groups. A weapon can be displayed before it is used. It can warn, intimidate, or mark identity before soldiers exist. There may already be people recognized as especially skilled hunters, dangerous fighters, or protectors. That does not mean a warrior class is formed. It means that the ingredients of later warrior identity are present in scattered form skill, reputation, risk, memory, and the admiration or fear of others. So the age of weapons before soldiers is not an age of primitive armies waiting off stage. It is an age of ambiguity. The same technologies that keep people alive also make harm more efficient. The same hunting skills that require patience, cooperation, and courage can be redirected toward human enemies when social worlds fracture. The same projectile that feeds a group can defend a boundary. The same club that cracks marrow can settle a feud. Tools do not create war by themselves. They wait inside the human world until fear, memory, pressure, and identity give them a different purpose. And when that happens, the line between survival equipment and weaponry becomes almost impossible to see until the wound is already in the bone. Bone is the closest thing deep prehistory has to testimony, but it is a difficult witness. It records force, direction, healing, infection, age, pressure, and sometimes the last moments of a life, yet it does not record anger, fear, command, or intention. A skeleton can show that a person was struck. It cannot always show who struck them, or why, or whether the blow came in a quarrel, a raid, a punishment, a ritual, an accident, or a desperate moment near food and water. This is why the evidence in bone is both powerful and treacherous. It gives the story of early violence its hardest material facts, but it also demands restraint. Every fracture is a clue, not a conclusion. The first question is whether a mark happened while the person was alive, around the time of death, or long after death. Living bone responds. It remodels, swells, smooths, and repairs. A healed fracture may show rounded edges, new bone growth, and signs that the injured person survived for weeks, months, or years. Such injuries can be deeply revealing, because survival after serious trauma often implies care, or at least continued support within a group. A person with a badly healed arm, damaged ribs, or skull injury may have needed time away from full physical effort. In a small community, that survival suggests social tolerance, shared food, and practical help. The same record that proves violence or danger can also prove compassion. Fresh bone behaves differently. Around the time of death, bone still contains moisture and organic resilience, so it breaks in patterns unlike old dry bone. Perimortem fractures may curve, spiral, or show sharp edges and smooth surfaces. Dry bone, broken long after death, tends to snap more irregularly. This distinction matters because ancient remains often suffer damage from burial pressure, excavation, erosion, animal activity, and later human disturbance. Without careful analysis, a break caused by thousands of years of sediment could be mistaken for a lethal injury. The evidence remains incomplete, but the methods have grown more careful. Archaeologists and bioarchaeologists now ask the bone not simply what mark it bears, but when the mark entered its history. Skulls receive special attention because they preserve some of the clearest signs of interpersonal violence. The human head is both visible and vulnerable. In face-to-face conflict, blows often land on the skull, especially the front and sides. Depressed fractures, where part of the cranial bone is pushed inward, can suggest blunt force from a stone, club, or other heavy object. Radiating cracks may show the force of impact. Repeated injuries, especially with similar shape or placement, can strengthen the case for deliberate attack. Yet skulls also fracture in falls, collapses, and accidents. A person slipping from a rock face or struck by falling stone may leave trauma that resembles violence. Context is everything: the shape of the wound, the position of the body, the presence of other injuries, and whether similar trauma appears in others nearby. The arms can tell another part of the story. Forearm fractures are sometimes interpreted as defensive injuries, especially when they occur in patterns consistent with a person raising an arm to block a blow. These so-called parry fractures must be treated carefully, because forearms also break in falls, work accidents, and hunting injuries. Still, when skull trauma and forearm injuries appear together, especially near the time of death, the possibility of violent encounter becomes stronger. The body, in these moments, preserves an ancient gesture, the arm lifted between the head and danger. No words survive, no attacker is named, but the skeleton may still carry the outline of a reflex shared across hundreds of thousands of years. Sharp force trauma offers a different kind of evidence. Cut marks made by stone tools can appear as narrow grooves, often with microscopic striations. On animal bones, such marks may show butchery, disarticulation, skinning, or marrow extraction. On human bones, interpretation becomes more sensitive. Cuts may indicate violence, post-mortem treatment, ritual handling, defleshing, cannibalism, burial preparation, or later disturbance. A cut across a throat region, a blade mark on ribs, or slicing around joints may suggest different actions depending on placement and pattern. Scholars still debate many cases because the same tool can serve many purposes, and the dead can be treated in culturally complex ways that are not reducible to cruelty. What survives in the record may show that a blade touched bone, but not always whether the act was murder, mourning, fear, survival, or ceremony. Projectile trauma can be among the most dramatic evidence. A stone point embedded in a human bone, a puncture wound matching a spear or arrow, or a fragment lodged among ribs can narrow the possibilities. A projectile entering the body is difficult to dismiss as ordinary burial damage, but even here, the story is not automatic. A projectile wound may result from battle, ambush, execution, feud, hunting accident, or isolated attack. The angle of entry, the location of the wound, the number of injuries, and the presence of multiple wounded individuals can help. A single embedded point tells one story of violence or misfortune. Many bodies with projectile wounds begin to suggest something broader, perhaps a raid or repeated hostilities, yet the line between these categories is not always visible in bone. Mass burials seem at first to promise stronger answers. When many bodies appear together, especially with unhealed trauma, it is natural to imagine massacre or battle. Sometimes that may be correct, but mass burial is one of the most complex forms of evidence. Bodies may accumulate over years, a cemetery may be reused, floods may move remains together, disease, famine, accident, execution, ritual practice, and violence can all gather the dead into one place. Even when trauma is widespread, it may represent repeated episodes rather than a single event. The difference matters. A massacre suggests one concentrated act. A cemetery with repeated violent death suggests a social landscape marked by ongoing conflict. Both are serious, but they are not the same. Healed injuries complicate the emotional reading even further. A skull wound that healed years before death reveals not only that violence or danger occurred, but that the injured person returned to life afterward. They may have continued to walk, work, teach, remember, and belong. Some healed injuries are severe enough to suggest long-term survival with impairment. This reminds us that the deep past was not simply a sequence of deaths. It was filled with survivors. A person could carry violence in the body as a permanent feature of identity. The wound might shape status, memory, caution, fear, or reputation. Archaeology cannot recover the personal meaning, but it can show that violence did not always end the story. Sometimes it became part of a life. There is also the matter of who receives injury. Patterns across age and sex can reveal social structure, but only cautiously. If trauma appears mostly among adult males, some researchers may interpret it as fighting, raiding, hunting danger, or socially patterned conflict. If trauma appears broadly across a community, the interpretation may shift toward massacre, wider attack, or harsh living conditions. But biology, preservation, sample size, and burial customs can distort the picture. A cemetery may not represent an entire population. Some bodies may be missing, some social categories may be buried elsewhere, some injuries may never reach bone. Soft tissue wounds, infection, strangulation, drowning, and many lethal events leave little or no skeletal trace. The violence archaeology sees may be only a fraction of the violence that occurred, while some marks it sees may not be violence at all. This is the central difficulty. Bone preserves consequence, not context. It can reveal force but not meaning. It can show that a life was interrupted, but not always whether by enemy, neighbour, kin, accident, or ritual. The temptation is to make every wound part of a grand theory about human nature. But the better reading is slower. Early human violence appears in fragments, clusters, patterns, and absences. Some marks point toward individual conflict, some toward repeated hostility, some toward group attack, some remain uncertain. And through all of them runs the same uncomfortable lesson: before war has a name, before soldiers exist, before any ruler counts enemies, human bodies are already recording the costs of fear, pressure, memory, and the dangerous closeness of social life. Some prehistoric places seem to lie at the edge of ordinary life, where archaeology stops feeling like the study of tools and settlements and begins to feel like the recovery of a disturbance. These are not always battlefields in the later sense. There are no walls to breach, no banners, no written names of enemies, no triumphant king describing the defeated. Instead, there are bodies found in ways that suggest something has gone wrong. People lying without the usual order of burial, injuries clustered in troubling patterns, stone points near or within human remains, bones placed in a landscape that once held water, food, movement, and danger. They are death sites at the margins, and they matter because they reveal how difficult it is to decide when violence has become collective. One of the most discussed places in this story lies in the Nile Valley, at a late Ice Age cemetery often known for its repeated evidence of trauma. It belongs to a world before farming has transformed the region, before the dynasties of Egypt, before the river becomes the spine of one of history's most famous civilizations. The people buried there live in a landscape shaped by climatic stress, changing water, and the opportunities and dangers of a great river corridor. Many remains show signs of injury, including wounds associated with stone projectiles. For years, this site has been described as one of the earliest examples of organized group violence, but more recent interpretations have complicated the image. Rather than one single battle or massacre, the evidence may point to repeated episodes of conflict over time, perhaps involving cycles of attack, retaliation, and danger in a crowded or stressed riverine world. The distinction is crucial. One terrible event is not the same as a long social condition in which violence returns again and again. The Nile Valley example shows why the margins of rivers and lakes are so important. Water concentrates life, and life concentrates risk. In harsh climatic phases, productive places may become rare enough to draw multiple groups into repeated contact. A river can be a road, a pantry, a boundary, and a trap. It allows people to fish, gather plants, hunt animals drawn to the banks, and travel through otherwise difficult terrain. But it also makes movement predictable. A group that depends on a river cannot simply abandon it without cost. If several groups return to the same rich corridor year after year, then memory begins to build around place. Encounters are no longer random. People may recognize old rivals, old exchange partners, old marriage connections, old dangers. Scholars still debate how much environmental stress contributed to violence in such settings, but the pattern is suggestive where survival depends on narrow productive zones. Conflict has fewer places to dissipate. Another famous and debated site comes from East Africa, near what was once a watery landscape in the early Holocene. The remains there have been interpreted as evidence of a violent encounter among people who are not yet settled farmers. This matters because it challenges the comfortable idea that warfare begins only with agriculture, stored grain, private property, and villages. The injuries at the site include signs consistent with blunt force and projectile trauma, and the arrangement of bodies has led some researchers to describe it as a raid or massacre. Yet the interpretation remains debated. Some argue that the remains may not represent one single event, or that the social meaning of the violence is uncertain. Others see it as strong evidence that mobile forager groups could engage in lethal group conflict under some conditions. What survives in the record suggests something serious happened, but the exact story remains just out of reach. The uncertainty is not a weakness. It is the point. These sites resist being turned into slogans. They do not prove that early humans lived in constant war, and they do not allow the opposite claim that war is purely a late invention of states. Instead, they occupy the uncomfortable middle ground. They show that collective violence was possible before cities, but they also show how rare and context-dependent clear evidence can be. For every site where injury survives, countless encounters leave nothing archaeologists can detect. A threat shouted across a valley, a group quietly leaving before dawn, a planned attack that fails, a revenge journey that ends without death, a body lost to scavengers or water. None of these becomes an easy archaeological fact. The record is both revealing and selective. Later, with the rise of more settled communities, death at the margins becomes easier to recognize, though not always easier to explain. In parts of Neolithic Europe, some sites preserve evidence of violent attacks on small farming communities, bodies in pits, repeated skull injuries, signs of hurried disposal, and patterns suggesting group assault have often been interpreted as massacres or raids. These places belong to a different world from the mobile forager landscapes of the earlier record. People are now more tied to houses, fields, livestock, stored food, and ancestral ground. Land and harvest can be defended, stolen, or destroyed. The community itself becomes a target in a way that is harder to imagine when people own little that cannot be carried. Yet even here, scholars still debate motives. Was the violence about land, revenge, captives, social collapse, competition, fear, or ritual? No single explanation fully accounts for every site. Fortified settlements add another clue, though again not a simple one. Ditches, palisades, walls, and defensive locations suggest concern with protection. But not every enclosure is a fortress. Some ditches mark boundaries, manage animals, display community labor, or serve ritual purposes. A wall can defend, but it can also define identity. A settlement on a hill may be chosen for visibility, drainage, status, or safety. Archaeologists look for combinations: defensive architecture alongside burned layers, weapon injuries, destroyed houses, hurried abandonment, or concentrations of projectiles. The more signs converge, the stronger the case for organized conflict. But the presence of a barrier alone does not prove war. Humans build boundaries for many reasons, and fear is only one of them. Caves and rock shelters also preserve death in ways that can seem mysterious. Sometimes bodies are placed carefully, sometimes remains are scattered, sometimes bones show cut marks, burning, breakage, or unusual treatment. In older interpretations, unusual treatment of human remains was often labelled as violence or cannibalism too quickly. Modern analysis is more cautious. Some practices may involve mortuary ritual, secondary burial, ancestor treatment, or symbolic handling of the dead. Others may indeed reflect violence, survival cannibalism, intimidation, or the aftermath of attack. The difficulty is that behaviour around death is culturally rich, and culture does not always announce itself in the bone. A body treated strangely by our standards may have been treated meaningfully by its own community. What connects these death sites at the margins is not a single origin of war, but a pattern of tightening conditions. Some lie near water, some appear during climatic stress. Some belong to more settled worlds where resources are stored and defended. Some show repeated violence rather than one event. Some preserve evidence of attack but not motive. They force the story away from easy beginnings. War does not seem to have been born in one valley on one morning. It emerges in scattered experiments of violence, some brief, some repeated, some remembered, some buried and lost. The dead at these sites are not symbols for a theory. They are the fragments through which theory must pass. And beneath every interpretation lies a quieter fact. Prehistoric communities lived with both the need for others and the fear of others. A group at a riverbank may need exchange, mates, news, and shared knowledge, yet fear an attack from those beyond its closest circle. A village may depend on neighbours for trade and marriage, yet build ditches against them. A mobile band may avoid strangers for safety, yet risk isolation without wider connections. The margins are where these contradictions sharpen. They are the places where paths cross, where resources concentrate, where memories return, and where the line between encounter and conflict can become dangerously thin. In the bones left behind, archaeology catches only the aftermath. But the aftermath is enough to show that long before war becomes an institution, human groups are already learning that survival beside others can be both the greatest protection and the deepest threat. A boundary begins long before anyone builds a wall. It can begin as a remembered path, a ridge crossed only at certain times, a river bend where one group expects to find fish, a cluster of trees known for fruit, a cave mouth associated with shelter, a stretch of coast where shellfish return with the tides, or a burial place where the dead make the land feel no longer empty. In the deepest past, human territory is not always marked by fences or stones. It is carried in memory. People know where they are allowed to move because others have moved there before them. They know where danger begins because stories have taught them to recognize it. They know who belongs close because faces, voices, Scars, ornaments, gestures, and shared histories create a map that is social before it is political. War becomes possible when these maps grow sharper. For mobile hunter-gatherers, boundaries are often flexible. A group's range may expand in wet years and contract in dry ones. A hunting route may be shared seasonally, avoided during tension, open through marriage, or closed after conflict. The same neighbouring people might be exchange partners in one generation and feared rivals in another. This flexibility is important because it prevents the past from looking too much like the modern world, with fixed borders drawn on paper. Prehistoric people do not need maps to know place, but their knowledge of place is lived rather than surveyed. A valley may be ours not because it is owned in a legal sense, but because it is remembered, used, sung about, defended, or associated with the lives of relatives. What survives in the record suggests that identity and landscape are deeply connected long before states appear. Kinship is one of the oldest ways boundaries become human. People divide the world into those who are close, those who are distant, and those whose intentions are uncertain. Kinship is not only biology, it is obligation. It tells people who shares food, who helps in crisis, who can marry whom, who must be avoided, who can be trusted with knowledge, and who may demand support after injury or loss. In small communities, kinship makes survival possible, but it can also make conflict spread. If one person is harmed, others may feel bound to respond. A wound is no longer private. It becomes attached to a web of relatives and allies. In this way, the same system that protects individuals can widen violence beyond the original dispute. Exchange can soften these boundaries. The archaeological record preserves hints of long-distance movement stone carried far from its geological source, marine shells found inland, pigments transported across landscapes, ornaments shaped from materials that must have travelled through hands and roots now lost. These traces matter because they show that prehistoric groups are not always isolated. Objects move, and with them may move stories, partners, warnings, techniques, and obligations. A piece of stone from a distant source may be more than a useful raw material. It may be evidence of contact, seasonal gathering, gift exchange, or a chain of relationships stretching beyond daily sight. The evidence remains incomplete, but the pattern is clear enough to challenge the image of small bands sealed off from one another in permanent suspicion. Yet exchange also defines difference. To trade with another group, people must recognize them as another group. To marry across a boundary, the boundary must exist. To meet seasonally, people must know who is expected, who is safe, who is dangerous, and who has violated trust before. Social networks do not erase identity, they organize it. They can make outsiders familiar, but they can also turn unfamiliar outsiders into threats by contrast. This is one of the quiet contradictions of human life. The wider the network, the more chances for cooperation, but also the more memories of betrayal, debt, rivalry, and unequal exchange. Human connection is not always peaceful. It carries obligations that can fail. Language, gesture, ornament, and style likely play a role in this growing sense of belonging. A tool can be made in a particular way not only because that shape works, but because that is how one's people make it. An ornament can mark identity, age, achievement, alliance, or memory. Pigments can colour bodies, objects, or burial practices in ways that signal belonging. Archaeologists are cautious here, because style is difficult to interpret across tens of thousands of years. A pattern in stone tools may reflect function, raw material, teaching tradition, mobility, or identity, and often more than one at once. Still, it would be strange if humans capable of complex social learning did not also use visible signs to recognize one another. Before flags, there are beads, ochre, scars, hairstyles, clothing, tool habits, and ways of moving through the world that say, quietly but powerfully, "These are my people." The phrase us versus them sounds modern, but the mental architecture behind it is ancient. Humans are extraordinarily good at forming groups. This ability allows cooperation among individuals who are not all close kin. It lets people coordinate tasks, share risk, defend companions, and build trust through repeated interaction. But the same ability can narrow moral concern. Those inside the circle are known, named, remembered, and protected. Those outside the circle may be treated with caution, suspicion, or fear. This does not mean humans are doomed to violence against outsiders. Many outsiders become allies. Many boundaries are crossed peacefully. But when fear rises, the human mind can make difference feel dangerous with great speed. Memory hardens boundaries more than geography alone. A ridge is just a ridge until something happens there. A water source is just a water source until a group remembers being driven away from it, welcomed at it, or warned never to approach it at dusk. Violence, once remembered collectively, changes the emotional map. It can turn a place into a warning and a neighbouring group into a story told with lowered voices. The first act may be small, perhaps even misunderstood. But memory does not preserve events like a neutral recording. It shapes them into meanings. Over years, a practical avoidance can become inherited suspicion. A seasonal route can become forbidden. A group once known through exchange can become known mainly through fear. This is where territory becomes more than space. It becomes identity under pressure. A group may defend a place not simply because food is there, but because leaving it means losing part of itself. Later farming communities will make this especially visible through houses, fields, storage pits, and graves. But even mobile groups can be deeply attached to landscapes. Repeated use creates belonging. Knowledge of a place is itself a form of wealth, where to find water in a dry month, which stones fracture well, which plants ripen after fire, which passes safe in snow, which cave floods after rain. To lose such knowledge by being forced away can be as serious as losing food. It means becoming less competent in the world. One lesser-known detail in the story of boundaries is that alliance can require distance as much as closeness. Groups may need partners beyond their immediate range precisely because local conditions can fail. During drought, poor hunting, disease, or social conflict, distant ties may allow people to move, marry, exchange, or seek temporary support. A population with wider networks may survive shocks better than one locked into isolation. This idea matters for understanding why Homo sapiens endured through severe climatic and demographic pressures. Survival may have depended not on one brilliant tribe, but on webs of groups that separated and reconnected over time. Yet those webs also create frontiers. Where networks end, uncertainty begins. As populations grow or landscapes tighten, boundaries become harder to ignore. Avoidance becomes more difficult when every useful valley has memory attached to it. Every water source is known, every hunting route overlaps, and every encounter carries the risk of old grievance. People may begin to watch not just animals and weather, but other people's movements, They may learn when neighbours travel, where they camp, what paths they use, what objects mark them, and what signs mean danger. These habits do not yet make armies, but they create the social knowledge that organised violence requires. To attack as a group, people must first imagine another group clearly enough to target it. The birth of war, then, is not only a story of weapons or hunger, it is a story of boundaries becoming meaningful enough to defend and frightening enough to cross with violence. The old human gifts are all present memory, cooperation, teaching, loyalty, imagination, and place knowledge. Under generous conditions, these gifts produce exchange, marriage, resilience, and shared survival. Under harsher conditions, they can produce suspicion, revenge, exclusion, and collective attack. The difference may be a season of drought, a failed alliance, a crowded river, a remembered killing, or the slow realization that moving away is no longer simple. Before war appears as an institution, it appears as a change in the human map, the world divided not only into safe and dangerous places, but into people who belong within the circle and people who stand beyond it. Beyond the boundaries of familiar groups, beyond the river corridors and remembered hunting grounds, there is an even stranger kind of encounter in the human past, the meeting not merely of neighbouring communities, but of different human populations whose names would not be known until the age of genetics. For most of history, people imagine the human story as if it belonged to one line moving forward, leaving behind less successful forms in the dark. Archaeology has made that picture harder to believe, and DNA has nearly broken it apart. The deeper record now looks less like a single road and more like a continent of crossing paths, where Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other ancient populations move through overlapping worlds, sometimes apart, sometimes near enough to leave traces in one another's descendants. If the birth of war depends on how humans draw lines between us and them, then these older meetings force a difficult question. What happens when them is human, but not quite the same human? The Denisovans enter science like a whisper, not through a complete skeleton standing proudly in a museum hall, not through a painted cave wall, not through a tool industry labelled with certainty, but through fragments from Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, a small bone, a few teeth, traces of ancient DNA, and later sediments holding genetic ghosts become enough to reveal an entire human population that had been hidden in plain sight. It is one of the most surprising turns in modern human origins research. For generations, scholars could only classify ancient humans through visible anatomy, skull shape, brow ridges, jaws, teeth, limb bones, stone tools, and burial contexts. Then DNA showed that a population could be almost physically invisible and still transform the map of human evolution. Denisova Cave itself matters because it is not merely a hole in the ground. It is a crossroads of deep time. Neanderthals were there. Denisovans were there. Modern humans may have moved through the wider region later. The cave preserves layers of occupation across changing climates, cold intervals, warmer phases, and shifting environments. It sits in a landscape where mountains, steppe, forest, and river routes create both refuge and corridor. Such places can draw different human groups across thousands of years, not necessarily at the same moment, but close enough in time and space for their traces to overlap. The cave becomes less like a home of one people and more like a recurring threshold, visited by different humans as the world changes around them. The physical evidence for Denisovans remains astonishingly slight compared with the weight they now carry in human history. A finger bone, several teeth, a jaw from the Tibetan plateau link through protein evidence, and additional genetic traces are not much on which to build a body. Scholars still debate what Denisovans looked like in detail, how varied they were across their range, and how far that range extended. They may have occupied large parts of Asia, perhaps from Siberia to highland regions and into Southeast Asian or island edge populations, though much remains uncertain. Their genetic legacy appears in some present-day populations, especially in parts of Oceania and Asia, suggesting that their encounters with ancestors of living people were not rare curiosities confined to one cave. They were part of a much wider human geography. This wider geography complicates the story of violence because contact is not the same as conflict. When different human populations meet, many outcomes are possible. They may avoid one another. They may compete for animals, shelters, raw materials, or roots. They may learn from one another indirectly by observing tools or movements. They may exchange, threaten, fight, or form relationships intimate enough to leave descendants. The genetic record proves that at least some boundaries were crossed biologically. Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry in living people means that separation was not absolute, but the same evidence does not tell us whether most encounters were peaceful, tense, rare, frequent, brief, or deeply embedded in social life. What survives in DNA is inheritance, not the emotional weather of the meeting. The relationship among Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens also shows why simple stories of superiority fail. Neanderthals and Denisovans share a closer relationship with each other than either does with modern humans. Yet all three belong to a broader human family with roots reaching back to earlier populations. There was likely a common ancestral population before their lines became more distinct, and even after separation, the story did not remain clean. Gene flow occurred, populations split and reconnected. Some groups persisted in small numbers, perhaps isolated by geography and climate. Others expanded, mixed, or disappeared into larger populations. No single explanation fully accounts for the fate of Denisovans or Neanderthals. Climate change, demographic fragility, competition, disease, assimilation, and chance may all have mattered. The vanished humans were not simply defeated pieces on a prehistoric board. One of the most remarkable parts of the Denisovan legacy is adaptation. In high-altitude populations of the Tibetan Plateau, a Denisovan-related genetic variant associated with living in low-oxygen environments appears to have helped later humans survive where the air is thin and the body is under constant stress. This detail is easy to overstate, but powerful when kept in proportion. It does not mean Denisovans handed modern humans a magic key to the mountains. It means that ancient mixing could occasionally preserve useful variation, and that survival sometimes depends on inheritance from people who no longer exist as separate populations. A vanished group can disappear from the landscape and still remain active inside the biology of living people. This inheritance changes the moral shape of the human story. It becomes harder to imagine Homo sapiens as a pure, isolated winner. Our ancestors endured not only by replacing, but also by absorbing, adapting, and carrying forward fragments of others. This does not erase the possibility of violence between groups. It simply prevents violence from becoming the only explanation. In some regions, encounters may have been hostile. In others, they may have been cautious, sporadic, or cooperative. In still others, the line between groups may have softened over generations through mating and shared descendants. The evidence remains incomplete, but the old image of separate species locked in a simple contest is no longer enough. For the birth of war, the Denisovan shadow offers a wider lesson. Humans are capable of making boundaries, but boundaries in deep time are often porous. The categories that seem clear to us now: Homo sapiens, Neanderthal. Denisovan may not have been experienced as scientific divisions by the people themselves. They may have seen difference in faces, bodies, speech, tools, scent, clothing, movement, or customs. They may have felt familiarity, fear, fascination, or mistrust. They may have recognized others as people, or as dangerous outsiders, or as something in between. Archaeology cannot recover those perceptions directly, but it can show that the human world before civilization was not empty except for us. It was populated by multiple human ways of being. By the time Homo sapiens expands widely across the world, the lessons of survival are already ancient move when necessary. Learn quickly, use many environments, keep social ties, and sometimes cross boundaries that seemed firm. The Denisovans remind us that some of those crossings were biological as well as geographic. They also remind us that disappearance is not always a clean ending. A people can vanish as a visible group and persist as a trace in genes, in adaptations, in the hidden architecture of bodies born thousands of generations later. War will later turn human boundaries into institutions of conquest and defense, but before that, the deepest boundaries are still shifting, uncertain and alive. In the cave sediments, in a tooth, in a fragment of bone, and in the blood of people living far from the Altai today. The vanished human world leaves a warning against simple answers. The story of us was always entangled with the story of others. The long age of movement does not end all at once. Farming does not fall from the sky and turn peaceful wanderers into warriors overnight. For thousands of years, people experiment with plants, animals, storage, seasonal camps, tending, burning, harvesting, and returning. Some groups remain highly mobile, some become partly settled, some farm and forage at the same time. Some try cultivation and abandon it. The old division between hunter-gatherer and farmer is too clean for the messy reality of human adaptation. Yet as more communities begin to live with fields, herds, houses, and stored food, something in the human relationship to place changes. Land becomes harder to leave. Food becomes easier to steal. Wealth becomes more visible, and violence, which once might have dissolved into distance, begins to gather around things that cannot simply be carried away. This is one of the hard edges of farming. It creates abundance, but not always security. A harvest can feed many people, support larger communities, and allow new crafts, rituals, buildings, and social roles. But a harvest can fail. A granary can burn. A herd can be raided. A field can be trampled. A water source can be blocked. The very success of producing food makes people more vulnerable to those who know where the food is kept. A mobile group with few stored goods may lose a campsite and still survive elsewhere. A farming village may lose a year's grain and face disaster. The shift is not simply from freedom to civilization, or from peace to war. It is from one set of risks to another. And some of the new risks invite organized defense. Stored food changes time. For most mobile foragers, food is often gathered, hunted, processed, shared, and consumed within shorter rhythms, though some storage certainly exists in favorable settings. Farming stretches those rhythms. Labor invested in spring may not pay off until harvest. Grain saved in one season may be survival in the next. Herds represent living wealth accumulated over years. Houses hold tools, seeds, vessels, memories, and sometimes the dead. This delayed return makes property emotionally and practically heavy. If a group walks away from a field too easily, it loses months of labour and perhaps its future. If it does not walk away, it must defend what it has made. The landscape that once offered escape now begins to hold people in place. Population growth adds another pressure. Farming can support more people per area than many foraging systems, though often with worse health, harder labour, and more dependence on a few staple foods. Larger communities create new possibilities, more hands to build, harvest, defend, and remember, more partners, more innovation, more ritual life. But larger communities also create more friction. More people live closer together. Disputes become harder to solve by simple separation. Waste, disease, inequality, and competition become sharper. When villages multiply across a landscape, empty buffer zones shrink. The old safety valve of distance weakens. A conflict that once might have ended with one group shifting its seasonal route may now involve houses, fields, graves, and stored grain that cannot be moved. The archaeological signs of this transition are varied and never perfectly uniform. In some Neolithic regions, settlements are open and show little obvious concern with defence. In others, ditches, palisades, walls, towers, or placement on defensible heights suggest anxiety or real danger. But caution remains necessary. Not every wall is a military wall. Enclosures can mark ritual space, social identity, animal control, drainage, or community labour. A ditch can be symbolic as well as practical. Archaeologists look for convergence fortification combined with burned buildings, weapon trauma, abandoned houses, mass death, concentrations of projectiles, or patterns of rebuilding after destruction. When several lines of evidence meet, the case for organised conflict becomes stronger. When only one sign appears, the past remains harder to judge. Inequality may be one of the deeper changes. In small mobile groups, large differences in wealth are difficult to maintain because possessions must be carried and sharing is often essential. With settlement, storage, livestock, land rights, and inheritance, differences can become more durable. Some households may accumulate more. Some lineages may control better fields, more animals, or more ritual authority. Prestige can become material. People can display ornaments, weapons, houses, feasting goods, or access to rare materials. Inequality does not automatically cause war, but it can create incentives for raiding, defense, domination, and revenge. A community with visible wealth becomes a target. A leader who gains status through successful violence may find followers. A young adult seeking prestige may see risk differently from an elder responsible for survival. Scholars still debate how early and how widely such dynamics appear, but the pattern becomes increasingly important as communities grow more settled. Herding adds its own form of danger. Animals move, reproduce, and can be stolen. Unlike a field, a herd can be driven away. Pastoral wealth is mobile wealth, and that makes it both flexible and vulnerable. Raiding livestock can be a way to gain food, status, marriage, wealth, or revenge without necessarily destroying a whole community. In many later societies, cattle or other herd animals become central to cycles of feud and alliance. For deep prehistory, the details vary by region and evidence is often incomplete, but the basic logic is clear. Once animals become property, conflict can follow the hoofprints. A raid can be planned, a counter-raid can be remembered. A boundary can form around grazing, water, and seasonal movement. Farming also changes the meaning of the dead. In many settled communities, ancestors become tied to houses, cemeteries, monuments, or fields. The dead may help claim the land, not in a written legal sense, but through memory and ritual presence. People belong where their dead are buried. This attachment can strengthen community identity and continuity, but it can also make displacement more painful. To abandon a place is not only to lose food, it may mean leaving behind the visible proof of belonging. When land becomes ancestral, conflict over land becomes more than economic. It becomes moral. A neighbouring group is not merely taking soil, it may be threatening the chain between past and future. Yet it would be misleading to blame farming alone for war. Some mobile foragers show evidence of violent conflict under certain conditions, and some farming communities appear relatively peaceful for long periods. Agriculture is not a curse that turns humans violent by itself. It is a powerful rearrangement of risk. It increases sedentism in many places, makes food and wealth more defensible, supports larger populations, narrows options for retreat, and creates new forms of inequality and inheritance. Under some conditions, these changes make organized conflict more likely. Under other conditions, they may be buffered by exchange, intermarriage, ritual cooperation, shared water management, or broad social networks. No single explanation fully accounts for the birth of war. The hard edge appears when flexibility declines. The deep human story has been one of survival through movement, broad diets, social learning, and the ability to adjust. Farming keeps some of that flexibility but reduces other parts. People can no longer always follow opportunity across the horizon. They must wait for crops, guard stores, tend animals, repair houses, maintain irrigation, and negotiate with neighbours who are also staying put. The world becomes richer and more crowded, more predictable in some ways and more fragile in others. A field promises tomorrow, but it also demands defence today. A granary promises survival, but it announces where survival is stored. So the birth of organised war begins to come into focus not as a single invention, but as a tightening around place. Tools become weapons more often because there is more to defend. Boundaries harden because people return to the same ground. Memory deepens because ancestors, labour, and harvest accumulate in one landscape. Violence that once might have remained a feud, ambush, or brief clash can now become a planned attack on a community's food, animals, houses, and future. Farming does not create the human capacity for violence. That capacity is far older, but farming gives violence new targets, new rewards, and new reasons to organize. In the shadow of the first fields, war is not yet inevitable, but it has found a more permanent home. Organized war is born slowly, and that slowness is easy to miss because later history trains the eye to look for dramatic beginnings. We're used to armies that march under names, rulers who claim victories, walls built against enemies, and weapons designed with no peaceful purpose left in them. But in prehistory, there is no single morning when war begins. There is no first general stepping out from a village gate. Instead, the evidence gathers in pieces a ditch dug deeper than it needs to be, a palisade rebuilt after burning, a cluster of bodies with similar injuries, a settlement placed where approach is difficult, projectiles found in unusual numbers, houses abandoned quickly, skulls marked by blows that do not heal, and later, graves where weapons begin to sit beside identity. War becomes visible not as one invention, but as a pattern that hardens. At first, defense may look like ordinary caution, A community chooses higher ground. It clears sight lines. It builds a ditch. It gathers houses closer together. It places storage where it can be watched. None of this proves war by itself. People protect themselves from animals, floods, theft, weather, and uncertainty. A ditch can drain water or mark community space. A wall can organize settlement as much as defend it. But when such features appear together with burned structures, hurried repairs, trauma in human remains, and repeated rebuilding, the mood changes. Archaeology begins to see not just architecture, but anxiety made into labor. A wall is a social decision. It means enough people agree that danger is real enough to move earth, cut timber, carry stone, and maintain a boundary over time. That maintenance is one of the quiet signs of organized conflict. A single fence can be built for many reasons, but a defended settlement requires repetition, watching, repairing, planning, storing, assigning effort, and convincing people that communal labor is worth the cost. This does not yet mean a state exists. It does not require kings. But it does require coordination beyond a sudden fight. It means the community is thinking collectively about danger. The enemy may not be named in writing, but the village body has changed shape around the possibility of attack. In this sense, fortification is not only a military technology, it is a change in imagination. People begin to build as if other people may come with harmful intent. Planned raids likely stand somewhere between feud and war. They may not involve large armies or permanent warrior classes, but they require preparation. People must choose a target, move together, decide when to strike, know the landscape, and accept the possibility of retaliation. A raid can be small and still organized. It can aim to seize animals, food, tools, captives, prestige, or revenge. It can be meant to frighten as much as kill. It can leave behind burned houses, broken gates, missing goods, and bodies that archaeologists later struggle to interpret. Raiding is important because it transforms violence from a reaction into a strategy. The point is no longer only to answer a wrong in the moment, but to use force in a planned way against another community. Mass violence becomes the darkest clue when many individuals die with signs of injury, especially in a setting that suggests sudden attack. The argument for organized conflict grows stronger. Some Neolithic and later prehistoric sites in Europe and elsewhere preserve evidence that communities were attacked with severe force, repeated head trauma, projectile wounds, bodies placed in pits or left without ordinary burial care, sometimes signs that houses were destroyed. Yet even here, the details matter. A mass death site may reflect massacre, execution, ritual killing, social collapse, epidemic followed by unusual burial, or repeated violence over time. Scholars still debate many cases because the dead rarely arrange themselves into categories that satisfy modern language. But when trauma, settlement, destruction, and defensive architecture appear together, it becomes difficult to avoid the conclusion that some communities were experiencing organized group violence. Weapons also begin to change their social meaning. In earlier worlds, a spear, bow, blade, or club may serve hunting, defense, craft, and conflict at once. Over time, some weapons become more closely tied to status and identity. They appear in graves. They are made with care beyond immediate utility. They become symbols of adulthood, courage, authority, or belonging. This does not mean everyone buried with a weapon was a warrior in the later professional sense. Graves are statements made by the living, and they can express aspiration, lineage, ritual role, or symbolic protection as much as biography. Still, repeated patterns of weapon burial suggest that certain societies begin to value the image of the armed person. War, or readiness for war, becomes part of how people imagine power. The warrior identity is not the same thing as the soldier. A soldier belongs to an organized military system, usually tied to a state, command structure, and formal campaigns. A warrior can emerge earlier in societies where personal reputation, kin loyalty, raiding skill, and courage matter deeply. Such figures may not fight full-time. They may farm, herd, hunt, trade, marry, and feast like others, but in moments of danger or opportunity, their ability to use violence becomes socially recognized. This recognition matters because it can turn violent success into prestige. Once prestige attaches to raiding or killing enemies, violence gains a reward beyond survival. It becomes a path to honor, fear, influence, and memory. Feasting and display may have played a role in this transformation. A successful raid can be turned into a story, spoils can be shared, allies can be rewarded, dangerous men can be praised or restrained, community gatherings can transform violent action into social meaning. The evidence for such processes in deep prehistory is indirect, but later and ethnographic parallels make the logic plausible. Humans rarely perform costly risks without social interpretation. A raid that brings back animals, goods, or symbolic trophies is not only an economic event, it can become proof of strength, a claim to leadership, or a warning to rivals. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise of warrior prestige, but once violence can be admired, it becomes harder to contain. At the same time, organized war requires enemies who can be imagined collectively. It is not enough that one person fears another. A whole group must be described, remembered, and treated as dangerous or legitimate to attack. This may happen through revenge cycles, competition over land, inherited suspicion, or stories of past harm. The more settled and bounded communities become, the easier it is to locate the enemy in space. They live beyond the ridge, across the river, inside that enclosure, near those fields, along that grazing route. Geography gives fear an address. A raid can now be repeated, answered, anticipated, and taught to the next generation as part of how the world works. This is where war begins to escape the event and become an institution. An event ends when the bodies are buried, the house is repaired, the animals recovered, or the attackers gone. An institution remains in habits keeping watch, training with weapons, building defenses, telling stories of enemies, honoring fighters, arranging alliances, negotiating peace, planning retaliation. Prehistoric societies may have developed these habits unevenly, and many communities may have avoided them for long periods. But where they appear, war is no longer only something that happens, it becomes something people prepare for before it happens. That preparation is one of the clearest marks of organized conflict. Still, the birth of organized war should not be told as a fall from innocence. Earlier people were not pure, and later settled communities were not simply corrupted. War emerges from ordinary human capacities pushed into new arrangements. Cooperation, memory, planning, loyalty, tool-making, place attachment, fear, and imagination. These are the same capacities that build houses, raise food, care for kin, make art, and preserve knowledge. Under some conditions, they also build walls, plan raids, and divide the world into defenders and targets. The tragedy is not that humans suddenly become something else. It is that the gifts that make large social life possible also make large-scale violence possible. By the time organized war is visible, its roots are already old. The first wounds in bone, the first remembered boundaries, the first defended resources, the first cycles of revenge, the first weapons displayed as identity, all of them have been gathering for millennia. War is not born fully armed. It assembles itself from smaller pieces of human life. A tool becomes a weapon, a neighbor becomes an enemy, a fence becomes a wall, a grievance becomes a duty, a brave act becomes a reputation, a raid becomes a tradition. And somewhere in that slow accumulation, the human world crosses a threshold. Violence is no longer only a danger to survive, but a practice some communities organize as expect and remember. The question of why war began is tempting because it seems to promise a single hidden key. If the key can be found, then the whole troubling pattern might finally make sense. Perhaps war begins because people become hungry. Perhaps it begins because land becomes valuable. Perhaps it begins because men seek status. Leaders manipulate fear. Strangers are easier to harm than kin, or farming creates wealth worth stealing. Each explanation catches part of the truth, and each becomes dangerous when it pretends to be the whole truth. War is too old, too varied, and too deeply tied to human social life to have one origin. It is better understood as a convergence, a place where many pressures meet until organized violence becomes thinkable, useful, honorable, necessary, or unavoidable to the people caught inside it. Ecology is one of the oldest explanations, and it has real force. When resources shrink, when drought reduces water, when cold shortens growing seasons, when herds move away, or when familiar landscapes fail, conflict can become more likely. A group that once avoided rivals by moving elsewhere may find that elsewhere is already occupied, too dry, too cold, too dangerous, or too poor. Productive zones become magnets. Rivers, wetlands, lake shores, mountain passes, grazing lands, and fertile valleys draw people together. In such settings, violence may not arise because humans suddenly become cruel, but because the costs of withdrawal rise. Yet ecology alone cannot explain war. People facing scarcity often cooperate, share, trade, migrate, or form alliances. Hard environments can encourage generosity as much as hostility. Environmental stress creates risk, not destiny. Population pressure adds another layer. As groups grow larger or landscapes become more densely occupied, encounters become more common. Empty buffer zones shrink. Disputes over hunting grounds, water, fields, or pastures become harder to solve by simple distance. In farming worlds, population growth can tie more people to smaller areas, increasing the importance of defended land and stored food. But population pressure is not a mechanical switch. Larger populations can also create broader networks, more marriage ties, more exchange, and more ways to absorb shock. A crowded landscape may produce war in one region and complex cooperation in another. Scholars still debate how much density matters by itself, because numbers only become dangerous through social arrangements. Revenge may be one of the more human explanations, because it begins not in abstract resources but in memory. A death, a theft, an insult, a trespass, or a broken alliance can become a story that demands answer. The original event may be small, confused, or even accidental, but once it enters group memory, it can grow larger than itself. Kin feel obligation, allies feel pressure. Younger adults inherit grievances they did not personally experience. In this way, violence escapes the moment and becomes history. revenge can feel morally necessary from inside a community, even when it looks destructive from outside. No single explanation fully accounts for war, but revenge helps explain how conflict can persist after the immediate material cause has passed. Hunger may start a raid, memory may keep the war alive. Prestige is another dangerous force. In many societies, risk can become reputation. The person who hunts successfully, travels far, defends the group, or returns from danger may gain admiration. This is not automatically warlike. Courage and skill are valuable in any difficult world. But when violent success against outsiders becomes admired, a new incentive appears. Raiding can bring not only food or animals, but honor. Weapons can become symbols. Stories can transform danger into identity. A person known for violence may attract followers, intimidate rivals, or gain influence in decisions. Prestige does not require a state. It requires only an audience. Once the group begins to reward organized aggression, violence can reproduce itself through ambition as well as fear. Fear itself may be more important than hatred. Hatred often comes later, after stories have hardened. Fear can come quickly, especially when groups do not know one another well. A neighboring community may be peaceful, but if it is capable of raiding, then waiting passively may feel dangerous. This creates the ancient logic of preemptive violence: attack before being attacked, strike before rivals grow stronger, raid before they raid you. Such reasoning can make war appear defensive to both sides. Each group sees itself as protecting its own people, land, food, or future. The tragedy is that mutual fear can produce the very danger it imagines. A defensive raid becomes proof of aggression, retaliation becomes duty, boundaries harden. Inequality changes the stakes. When some households, lineages, or leaders control more stored food, livestock, land, ornaments, or ritual authority, violence can become a way to seize wealth or protect privilege. Inequality also creates people who may benefit more from war than others. A leader can gain followers through successful raids. A lineage can expand influence by controlling land or captives. A community can use violence to protect surplus. But inequality does not explain every conflict, especially earlier ones among mobile groups. It becomes more powerful where wealth can accumulate and be defended. Farming, herding, storage, and settlement make that accumulation more visible. War may begin before strong inequality, but inequality can help war grow teeth. Culture shapes all of these pressures. The same scarcity that leads one group to share may lead another to raid. The same injury that one community resolved through compensation may lead another into revenge. The same weapon that symbolizes hunting skill in one place may symbolize warrior identity in another. Culture tells people what violence means, when it is justified, who may carry it out, what counts as courage, what counts as shame, and when peace is acceptable. Human beings do not respond to pressure as simple animals in a laboratory. They respond through stories, obligations, rituals, memories, and expectations. Material conditions matter, but meaning decides how people act within them. There is also the uncomfortable possibility of chance. A drought arrives during a period of tense relations. A respected mediator dies. A raid succeeds too well and encourages imitation. A small injury is misread as deliberate. A leader emerges who turns fear into power. A new weapon spreads through a region already full of grievance. Prehistory is shaped not only by great forces, but by sequences of events that could have gone otherwise. War often grows from the interaction of structure and contingency, long pressures, waiting for a spark that no one can reconstruct. The deepest answer may be that war begins when cooperation turns outward in a hostile form. Humans are not violent because they fail to cooperate. Organized war requires cooperation of a frighteningly effective kind. People must coordinate movement, share risk, obey signals, trust companions, remember enemies, and sacrifice personal safety for group goals. The same abilities that allow humans to survive deserts, forests, ice margins, highlands, and crowded villages also allow them to attack together. War is not the opposite of social intelligence. It is one of its darker uses. That is why the story is so unsettling. The roots of war lie close to the roots of care, loyalty, teaching, and belonging. So why did war begin? Because landscapes changed, because people grew more numerous, because food and land became defensible, because memory carried wounds forward, because prestige could attach itself to danger, because fear made preemption seem wise, because inequality created prizes and protectors, because culture gave violence meaning, because chance turned tension into precedent. None of these explanations is enough alone, but together they show how war could emerge again and again in different places, not as a single invention but as a recurring human possibility. It began wherever survival, identity, resources, and memory tightened until groups no longer merely endured violence, but organized it. When war becomes visible in history, it already looks ancient. The first written records do not describe a brand new human behavior being discovered for the first time. They describe rulers, enemies, captives, fortified towns, tribute, vengeance, divine favor, boundary disputes, and victories claimed as if organized violence has long since become part of the political imagination. By the time kings begin carving their triumphs into stone, war has already passed through many earlier forms: feud, raid, defense, retaliation, ambush, massacre, fortification, warrior prestige, and the slow hardening of group identity. Writing does not create war. It gives war a voice, and that voice is often the voice of power, explaining why its violence was necessary, glorious, sacred, or inevitable. This is one reason the prehistoric story matters. Without it, war can seem to begin with states, as if the first kings invented collective violence from nothing. States do change war profoundly. They make it larger, more organized, more extractive, and more capable of reaching across distance. They can gather food, labor, metal, animals, boats, roads, messengers, and young adults into systems of command. They can turn seasonal raiding into campaigns, defense into taxation, victory into monument, and memory into official history. But the roots they use are older. Loyalty to one's own group, fear of outsiders, revenge for past injury, defense of land, prestige through risk, and the symbolic power of weapons all exist before palaces and archives. The state does not invent these forces, it harnesses them. Empires take the same pattern farther. They widen the circle of us, but they also widen the circle of acceptable enemies. A village may fear the next valley, a chiefdom may raid across a river, an empire can imagine whole regions as targets, provinces, rebels, or frontiers. It can turn distant strangers into categories on a map. It can make violence bureaucratic, giving orders to people who will never meet the ruler who benefits from them. Yet even imperial war still depends on older human capacity shared stories, obedience to group symbols, trust among companions, fear of dishonor, desire for reward, and the belief that the people beyond the boundary are different enough to be fought. The scale changes, the social machinery deepens, but the emotional materials are not new. Myths and sacred stories often preserve this older ambiguity. Across many ancient cultures, war is not described only as practical conflict over land or wealth. It is woven into tales of gods, ancestors, cosmic order, heroic duty, betrayal, punishment, and restoration. Such stories can restrain violence by giving rules to conflict, but they can also sanctify it. They can make a battle feel larger than human fear. They can turn a fallen fighter into a model, a defeated enemy into a warning, or a conquered land into destiny. The details differ across cultures, and scholars still debate how much myth reflects memory, ideology, ritual, or poetic imagination. But the pattern is unmistakable once war enters storytelling. It becomes more than an event. It becomes a way societies explain themselves. Law emerges partly from the same need to control violence. As communities grow larger, revenge cannot be allowed to expand endlessly without threatening the whole social order. Compensation, punishment, exile, trial, treaty, taboo, and ritual settlement all become ways to keep injury from becoming a permanent bloodline of retaliation. Early law codes, where they survive, often reveal societies trying to measure harm what is owed for injury, theft, insult, killing, damaged property, broken obligation, or violated boundary. This does not mean law ends violence. Often it protects hierarchy and legitimizes state power. But it shows that humans understand the danger of unchecked revenge. The same species capable of organizing war also creates rules to contain the smaller fires from which war can grow. Memory is perhaps the most durable battlefield. A war ends, but the memory of it can continue to shape identity for generations. People remember who attacked, who defended, who fled, who betrayed, who survived, who was lost, and who must never be trusted again. Some memories are preserved in monuments, others survive in songs, genealogies, place names, scars on landscapes, burned layers beneath rebuilt settlements, or warnings passed quietly through families. Archaeology sees only part of this. It finds the ditch, the wound, the weapon, the ash, the grave. It cannot always recover the story that made those traces meaningful. Yet the existence of later historical memory helps us imagine how earlier communities may have carried violence in ways that left no words as caution. Boundary, obligation, and inherited fear. The legacy of early violence is therefore not simply the rise of battle. It is the rise of a human ability to organize emotion across time. Fear becomes preparation, injury becomes grievance, courage becomes reputation, victory becomes authority, defeat becomes memory, a boundary becomes identity. This ability is dangerous, but it is also inseparable from the abilities that make complex human life possible. The same long memory that preserves a feud can preserve a migration route. The same loyalty that drives revenge can sustain care during famine. The same coordination that makes a raid possible can build a house, dig a canal, organize a harvest, or protect a community from disaster. Human beings did not survive deep time by being the most powerful animals in the landscape. They survived by being flexible, social, inventive, and capable of carrying knowledge beyond one lifetime. War grows from those capacities when they are turned toward collective harm. That is the unsettling truth left by the long record. Violence is not a foreign object inserted into human history from outside. nor is it the whole truth of human nature. It is one possible expression of powers that also produce tenderness, teaching, alliance, and resilience. The bones with wounds matter, but so do the healed fractures. The weapons matter, but so do the tools used to feed and build. The walls matter, but so do the paths of exchange that connect communities across distance. Even the vanished humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans among them, remind us that the deep human world was not a simple tournament of winners and losers. It was a web of meetings, mixtures, separations, and disappearances, where survival often depended on connection as much as competition. War remained because humans remembered. It remained because groups could teach not only how to make a blade, but whom to fear, not only where to find water, but which valley to avoid, not only how to honour the dead, but who was blamed for making them dead. And once such memories entered institutions, they became harder to dissolve. States, empires, laws, myths, and borders all carried forward older patterns in more durable forms. Yet the same record also shows that humans repeatedly made peace, exchanged goods, formed alliances, intermarried, absorbed strangers, and rebuilt after violence. The birth of war is not the birth of humanity. It is the shadow cast by humanity's deepest social gifts when the world tightens, fear hardens, and the circle of belonging closes. At the end of this long path, the first wound in bone no longer feels like a simple mark of cruelty. It feels like a doorway into the fragile condition of being human. The past does not show a species born for war alone, and it does not show a species untouched by violence until civilization ruined it. It shows people and their ancestors moving through changing worlds, trying to live with hunger, weather, memory, and one another. Sometimes they walked away. Sometimes they shared. Sometimes they healed the injured and carried knowledge across generations. Sometimes they drew a line and defended it with everything they had. The deeper the story goes, the quieter it becomes. A cave keeps a broken skull in darkness. A riverbank holds stone points and scattered bone. A buried village preserves ash where houses once stood. A fragment of Denisovan DNA travels silently through bodies thousands of years after the people who carried it vanished as a separate group. A field, a wall, a grave, a tool, a scar. Each holds one small piece of a history too large to recover completely. What remains is not certainty, but a pattern. Humans survive by belonging to one another, and belonging can become both shelter and weapon. The circle that protects can exclude. The memory that teaches can accuse. The hand that lifts, feeds, and repairs can also strike. This is the difficult inheritance carried out of deep time, not a command to repeat the past, but a warning about how easily survival, fear, loyalty, and pride can be braided together. And still, across the same immense span, there is another image. People move under cold stars, carrying tools, food, stories, and the injured. Smoke rises from a temporary camp and disappears into a sky no one has named. Somewhere beyond the firelight, another group is moving too. They may become enemies. They may become kin. They may pass without meeting at all. The wind covers their tracks, the seasons turn, and the earth keeps only what it can. In that silence, the human story continues unfinished, uncertain, dangerous, and strangely tender, fading into the long dark before history, where the first boundaries were drawn, not on maps, but in memory.